Hello, hello. Very warm welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to today's virtual knowledge series event, applying circular economy strategies to extend the life of existing buildings in Canada, which is brought to you by Circular Economy Leadership Canada and the CSA Group. My name is Paul Shorthouse. I'm the Managing Director of Circular Economy Leadership Canada, and I'll be your host for today's virtual event. You go to the next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Before we kick things off, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm really fortunate to join us today from the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples, more specifically the Lekwungen-speaking peoples here in Victoria, British Columbia, where I'm based, which is a land that is very rich in history and in culture, and where I'm very honored to share in its stewardship. And we want to take a moment to acknowledge that we have attendees here joining us from the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast for this event, as well as a number of international participants. So a very warm welcome to everybody who's on the line here. We had over 300 people register for today's event. So lots of interest from the construction and real estate industry, from governments at all levels, from innovators and investors. I'd like just to take a moment there to invite you as our participants today to put your names and organizations into the chat box. You'll see there's a chat box and a Q&A box. If you want to drop your names and organizations in the chat box, we'd love to know who's joining us for today's session. Next slide. So Circular Economy Leadership Canada is part of a broader family of organizations under the umbrella of the Natural Step Canada, which is a not-for-profit charity, and we're focused on advancing a strong and inclusive economy that thrives within nature's limits. CELC is focused on a number of strategic priorities in Canada, which you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen here, and we do this by using sort of a multi-pronged approach. So we support convening and relationship building across Canada's circular economy ecosystem, including through some of our events and community platforms. We're also working to share information and evidence on the benefits that circular strategies and solutions can bring in terms of advancing social, economic, and environmental goals, including that linkage between circularity and climate action. And we're also focused on accelerating circular economy transitions in very specific sectors and sort of material streams that are very important to Canada in terms of our opportunities and competitiveness. And one of those strategic sectors where we're focused on is on the construction, real estate, and the built environment, which is the focus for today's Knowledge Series webinar. And just so you know, the Knowledge Series events that we put on are free public events that are dedicated to sharing information on topics relevant to the circular economy transition in Canada, with the objectives of increasing education and accelerating action in this space. So a little bit more on the project background, if you go to the next slide, and the purpose for today's webinar. So we know that buildings are one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, and many of Canada's real estate and construction sector players are setting climate and net zero goals, as it's become really a matter of both long-term sustainability and financial viability. We've seen and know that constructing even the most energy efficient buildings entails significant upfront carbon emissions. And as buildings operations become increasingly low carbon by design, a greater focus on embodied carbon and on extending the life of existing buildings will be really important for truly achieving net zero. Our circular economy strategies that can be applied to existing buildings that are practices like design for flexible use, or adaptive reuse, or repair, or retrofit and upcycling, and other innovative strategies that can help extend the life of buildings can also preserve the embodied carbon in those materials as part of the process. But the questions in terms of under what conditions does extending the life of commercial office buildings make sense from a financial perspective, or how can whole life carbon costing or life cycle costing, including the cost of carbon, be integrated into commercial office real estate investment decisions, are a couple of the questions that we sought out to answer as part of this 12-month initiative that we're sharing the results of today. And this project involved 10 industry and government partners as part of this initiative that was led by CELC in collaboration with CSA Group. Our project partners and funders included BOMA Canada, Ellis Don, Epic Investments, Hallmark, Jones Lang LaSalle or JLL, Natural Resources Canada, the National Research Council of Canada, or the NRC, the Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions, or PICS, and the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. And the research that we produced included 2 technical reports that were published by the CSA Group, which we'll learn more about today, which looked at really exploring the benefits of applying circular strategies to extend the life of existing buildings, with a specific focus on commercial office buildings. So if you go to the next slide, I'm pleased to introduce our project partner from CSA Group, Ivica Karas, who is the Manager of Strategic Initiatives for Construction and Infrastructure Standards, to share a few words. We've been partnering with CSA Group now for the last couple of years to explore how circular strategies can be applied to advance the goals and improve the performance of Canada's construction and built environment sector. So Ivica, over to you to share a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good morning and good afternoon all. My name is Ivica Karas, and I'm the Manager of Strategic Initiatives for Construction and Infrastructure Standards at CSA Group. We are proud to be co-hosting this webinar with you, Paul, and the Circular Economy Leadership Canada, and it's really wonderful to see some familiar and also some new faces here today. So in daily life, standards are often invisible, but if you think at home, at work, and in our communities, standards do shape practically every product and service that we encounter. We published our first standards on steel railway bridges in 1920, and since then we've been working to fulfill our role in advancing standards in the public and private sectors. CSA, next slide, please. We are a not-for-profit, member-based organization with a mission really to enhance lives of Canadians through the improvement of safety, health, the environment, and economic efficiency in Canada and beyond. Our standards are developed through the insight of more than 11,000 technical experts that collaborate in committees and work to achieve consensus on requirements for specific subjects. We conduct research to inform the development of standards in wider regulatory industrial landscapes, and we also provide training and educational tools to support users and help people understand and implement standards. At our core, though, we are really focused on delivering societal good through the breadth of standards that we develop. And next slide, please. So we've been working to tackle the role of standards in key areas of society that we have really significant impact on the construction sector. I'll just name a few, such as helping to build resilience into our communities, and standards also to guide the construction of modular buildings and support regulators in understanding this construction methodology. On circularity specifically, we have been working on circularity for the built environment for many years, but until recently, concepts such as design for disassembly and our guide on that, adaptability and deconstruction were unheard of. So we waited patiently as we knew these concepts were real, important, and would also serve society well. We just needed a catalyst. That is why we are very thankful to CELC, with whom we've partnered on a number of initiatives, including on funding 2 of the research studies that directly supported the development of CELC's guide for commercial real estate sector. We are thankful not only to Helen Goodland of SciS Advisory and Ryan Zizzo of Mandel Developments, who are the leaders on our research team and were in charge of these 2 studies, reports, but also we are thankful to all of you present today for insight and input to shape these studies. As we will momentarily hear from Helen and Ryan, these reports provide a breadth of guidance and best practices on extending the lives of existing office buildings by looking at things such as design interventions for optimizing existing buildings, ways to minimize waste, reuse of salvage construction materials, and also the role of embodied carbon and life cycle assessments. So today we will hear that conditions are ripe for extending the lives of existing office building stock through upgrades, renovations, conversions, and other creative forms of adaptive reuse, and a combination of private sector financing, public policy, standards, and industry could help implement and scale circular strategies. At CSA Group, we are thrilled to continue helping in facilitating the uptake of circular economy strategies for real estate sector and more widely for the built environment as a whole. So thank you all, and back to you, Paul.
Perfect, thanks, Ivica. Ivica mentioned the industry guide, which, as I mentioned earlier, is essentially a consolidation of the technical reports that CSA Group published as a sort of more concise guide for industry in the real estate sector. We'll drop in the chat box a link to this guide. If you go to the next slide, though, you'll see kind of on the table of contents what the guide covers. and a range of concepts and practices across sort of circular strategies, and also gives a really great number of different examples and case studies, both what's happening in Canada, but also some of the global commercial office market, including some tools and additional resources for helping people get started in this space. So just to cover today's objectives, so a little bit more about the focus for today's session. We want to share a bit about what circular strategies are and how they can be applied to office buildings, but also commercial real estate more broadly. We'll speak a bit about why these strategies can help and how they're important for meeting environmental, social, and economic benefits. We'll talk a little bit about how life cycle carbon and greenhouse gas emission benefits can be related to extending the life of existing buildings. And lastly, how circular strategies can be implemented, including opportunities for making the business case for action in this space. So just wanted to cover briefly the next slide, our webinar agenda. We've got a couple presentations right off the bat from the authors of those CSA Group technical reports, Helen and Ryan. We invite you to send your questions for the speakers as we go directly into the Q&A box, which you'll see is separate from the chat box, but we'll bring some of these questions forward. You can actually vote them up as we go, so feel free to add your questions in. We'll then invite a panel from industry to reflect on the presentations, and we'll host a bit of a discussion on some of these insights, including perspectives, as you'll see, from across the value chain and some of the leading businesses and business considerations. And we'll save some time for a Q&A with the panel at the end. So again, feel free to also share comments or links in the chat box as we go, and we'll try and consolidate that as part of a summary. So without further ado, and kick things off, I'm really delighted to introduce Helen Goodland. Go to the next slide. And Helen is the principal and head of research and innovation at CSA Advisory, who led that research on the first technical report for CSA Group on opportunities to apply circular strategies to existing office buildings. And Helen and I have worked together for more than a decade on the topic of green building. Helen's an architect registered in the UK, but has been working here in Canada for many years, who brings over 30 years of experience on transformative solutions in the real estate and the construction industries in Canada and from around the world. So Helen, over to you, and I think you have some slides you'd like to share.
Thanks, Paul. Very warm good morning to everybody. Lovely to see you all. Thrilled that this is such an important topic to so many people. So yes, as Paul mentioned, we are, me and my team at CSA, this is very much a team effort. We're involved in the first of the CSA studies, and in fact provided the content for the guide that Paul just shared briefly. So the focus of the report that we provided for CSA is really the focus of what I'm going to be talking about shortly, and it's a very substantial guide, and there is I'm worried about being able to do it justice in just a few minutes, but essentially what the guide has inside is the way it's organized is it provides an overview of the commercial office market in Canada. It runs through some circular strategies, really following the life cycle of the building process. And then it talks a little bit about the policies and standards, looking at sort of civic, regional, national policies, building code, and then it also goes into economic measures, broad range of regulations, and of course, there's a emerging information-based and voluntary approaches that we're seeing in green building rating programs and so forth, and of course, a very substantial section on the state of play as it relates to standards in Canada, and then also looking at the standards that are in development and both here and around the world.
Helen, just pointing out that we're seeing your notes section, not the presenter slide.
Okay.
So there's a way to make your slides show up for everybody.
How's that? Does that work better?
No, I think you've got to share your other screen.
That I'm not going to be able to do in that. It was working just beautifully before, wasn't it?
One more time.
Maybe could you share that? Thank you. That's probably much better if you could get to slide number 3.
Thank you. That's perfect.
So yes, if you could move to go on and on. Lovely. Next one. So yeah, so I think where the back up one sec to the big issues for the office sector, because I really want to set the scene for why we're talking about the commercial office space. And I think it's been pretty clear to everybody that not only is the office sector a very substantial part of Canada's overall real estate portfolio, 3.3 billion square feet, 309 million square meters, but with the pandemic, the way that people engage with the workspace has fundamentally changed. And what you'll see in the bottom right hand is that there has been a persistent rise in vacancies since the pandemic. In other words, people are not going back to their former ways of working. The nature and role of the office itself is really something that is being rethought substantially. And what you'll see also is that if you go to the next slide, that the industry has recognized this, and spending on renovations and repair of existing office structures has been going up and has been departing from what usually has been a fairly close tracking of new construction since 2019. Obviously, it moves up and down in the past, but currently we see a lot of investment in renovations. So in the interest of not wasting a good crisis, this is obviously the moment in which we can be thinking very substantively about how to create circular strategies in the office building sector. Next. There's other business cases for circularity. I think we're going to get into more of these shortly, but everything from reducing operating costs, engaging customers and employees, attracting new tenants, I think is going to be an incredibly important one, and we'll hear from others on that. But there's also opportunities to spur innovation. The building industry is very large and has a great role to play in Canada's innovation and competitive stance across a number of sectors. Next. The way we've organized our report is around the sort of 4 key areas, and really, as I say, following the life cycle of the building process. So there is a number of circular design strategies that are discussed, and within each we are providing examples from Canada and around the world. So everything from upgrades and renewals, tenant fit outs, versatile design, and so forth. And then we get into circularity in the field. We're looking at how construction process, tenant improvement processes can adopt circular practices. We look at sort of at the end of life and then back into new life of products and materials, circular input strategies, secondary material markets, and so forth. And then I think the most important piece of all of this is, well, where do we start? So in the top left-hand corner is looking at what are the underutilized circular strategies that really we're sort of starting to do today, and what can we really leverage to get moving in this area first. So those are, life cycle thinking, which of course Ryan is going to be talking about, digitization of the design and construction processes, gathering data, finding out more about what we're really doing, and then finally innovative leasing models. And we're seeing quite a lot of really amazing and creative solutions to making leasing more attractive to the market. Next. So a couple of examples. So here's a very simple zero waste fit out in Calgary that Integral did for their own office. Zero waste meant that they saved on average, there's around 7 tons of waste coming out of the typical renovation for an office. If you can get that down to 0, that's great. The next slide shows you how you can upclass an existing low-grade office building, a sort of quasi-commercial industrial building, into a really top-notch, low-carbon, zero-carbon office building, which LeMay, which is an architecture firm in Montreal, did for their own offices. Again, elegant, simple, stylish, very nice. Hopefully somebody is from LeMay on the call, so bravo. Next one is, there's a lot of talk in Alberta right now for Calgary and Edmonton in converting offices into residential building. There's a development funding program to help with that. But this is an interesting project because they converted an office building, an old energy company's building, into a hotel, a very high-class hotel, in the face of what was not necessarily the greatest hotel market at the time. So that was a really interesting solution. Next. In the US, we're seeing this in Canada too, there's a great example of adding a mass timber structure on top of an existing concrete building to save on foundation additions. If they had just added concrete or steel, they'd have had to upgrade foundations. Next slide is an example from Australia, which is very interesting approach to sort of a whole building leasing strategy. Suncorp is a very large company in Melbourne, Australia, and they were able to set up their new building really around their leasing approaches. So they were able to plan for future expansion, contraction, attracting other tenants, even co-working opportunities. So that's their building. And then, of course, within that, they were exploring on-demand space where they allow tenants to rent individual components, meeting rooms, equipment, and precincts, so that, you know, in the event that you want to expand beyond your building, you've actually got more than one building that works together in your leasing strategy. So super interesting case study. Next. What I want to sort of wrap up with is regulatory environment in Canada is really sort of fairly limited when it comes to circular strategies. We look at construction process and renovation at the federal scale, and that filters into building codes, but waste management and material disposal and handling is very much a provincial issue. Next. But supporting that is there are a number of emerging policies, voluntary programs, and market mechanisms, which are sort of precursors to the regulatory world. So you see a number of standards sort of tested out and integrated into the building industry's lexicon through things like LEED and procurement programs, and they sort of are good indicators of what's to come. And there's a lot of work being done in this area. Next. So I want to wrap up with a couple of sort of brief mention of the standards that Ivica noted at the beginning. So we, as part of our study, did look at dozens of standards. And of course, these are the highlighted ones that, of course, have been around for some time, and we were looking at their applicability. But if you move to the next slide, you'll see a sort of ecosystem of standards. Now, you're not intending to read all of these. This is really to give you a snapshot of how much is available out there. The dark blue are the standards that are in practice today. And you see those in building codes, the National Master Specification, and those are in common practice. But the blue ones, the light blue ones, are the ones that are sort of in development. They find themselves in green building rating programs. And those are the ones that we need to be starting to look at integrating into more mainstream regulatory frameworks. So it sort of gives us a good sense of what's happening. And finally, I think just to wrap up on this is my absolute last slide. On the horizon, there is work afoot, and I noticed on the call we've got a number of people from various building code organizations and authorities. So there are upgrades to National Building Code underway as I speak. So there's going to be some operational GHG emission requirements introduced in 2025, the federal level, the National Building Code. Embodied greenhouse gas emission requirements will be introduced in 2030. This is the timeline as I understand it right now and what we've been told. And this work will also inform the application of alterations to existing buildings, which of course are sort of regulated under the building code, but there is obviously more sophistication needed. And a national retrofit code is expected in 2030 as well. There's a number of low carbon guidelines out there, but there is one that's being that's currently in use that considers life cycle carbon emissions for federally funded projects, which is a good role model. The National Master Construction Spec is being revitalized as well. And then I think the big piece for me particularly is that certainly out here in British Columbia, which is where I'm from, there is a digital construction initiative where we're digitizing the BC Building Code, and I believe that there is a digitization effort underway at the federal level and for the National Master Specification as well. And that will really help us create a lot more data gathering, methodologies and conventions. And that's it for me, Paul, I believe. I know I've sort of rushed and I don't know that I've done it justice. It's a very substantial report, but I'm really happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, you covered a lot of content there and some really great examples of some case studies that you sort of shared at a high level, but there's some excellent more detail within that technical report that I've just put the link back into the chat box there for people where you can dig into some of that. I'm not seeing any questions just yet in the Q&A box, but I welcome people to share some of those. And just as people are thinking about questions for you, Helen, I will looks like one's just coming here about green procurement. So you mentioned earlier voluntary programs and how that could transition into more of a mainstream kind of consideration for, standard procurement processes as a business as usual. So I know you've done a lot of work around innovative procurement. Any initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I mean, I know that there are experts in the procurement world. I mean, I'm an architect, and I sort of look from the industry standpoint as to how it plays out in the real world. But I do think that there are a number of procurement standards out there. The federal one that they use, where they're asking for embodied carbon considerations, I think is a really important first step. Paul, you probably are aware of there's a social procurement, there's a circular procurement initiative at the federal level that isn't construction specific necessarily, but I think the philosophy behind it is pretty similar, that you need to set very clear metrics of what your values are. And I think this is going to get to what your question was that you were trying to tee up for me about what the barriers are. The issue that the industry is facing is that there is a short-term sort of view on value when it comes to construction, and we're not taking a life cycle approach, partly because the commercial nature of it, that there's this sort of the development industry then hands off to the operational and asset management industry, and we don't have vested interests in the life cycle of our buildings over the long term at the design and construction phase, right? We're not thinking long term enough for the decisions we make to have economic or strategic value to our owners and clients. So I think it's the value question that we have to really tackle. Those procurement standards that start to look at, well, what are the real values that the owners and clients are trying to drive towards? And it needs to be triple bottom line, right? It's not just about economics, because the economics are going to be informed by social issues. Do you have the people with the right skills? All of those things, right?
Policy and others, yeah. Thanks
totally
for that. I know there's a few other questions that have come in the Q&A and also in the chat box. So in the essence of time, what I might do is invite Ryan to share his presentation, and then we can go back to a bit more questions. But if you want to respond to some of those, Helen, in the Q&A box as Ryan's presenting, that would be great. Ryan, sure. Thanks very much, Helen. Appreciate that. And I'd love to introduce Ryan Zizo, who's the founder and CEO of Mantle Developments, which is a consultancy focused on climate smart infrastructure and buildings based in Toronto. And his team led the research for the second technical report for CSA Group, which involved undertaking LCA analysis of extending the life of existing office buildings in Canada through retrofit versus demolition and new construction. So a bit of a comparison on the carbon side. So Ryan, over to you. And I know you've got some insights to share there.
Great. Thanks, Paul. And yeah, great to be here. Happy to be chatting with you all today. Looking forward to the discussion afterwards as well. So as Paul mentioned, I'm going to be diving into that second report that was mentioned earlier that me and my team were working on, and we were looking specifically at the carbon impact of some of these reuse strategies. So just very quickly, Mantle Developments, we help firms with embodied carbon management. We help a lot of developers actually to manage this, quantify and reduce the embodied carbon on their projects, and also help policymakers and researchers do work like this to really understand the impact of these policies and help get them more broadly exposed in the market. I'm going to just take a couple slides here to give a little bit more of an overview of what we specifically mean when we say embodied carbon, because I know it's not a super common term to some folks in the industry. It's kind of relatively new, but embodied carbon is what we mean when we say all of the carbon footprint associated with basically the materials associated with our construction projects. So how materials are made, all of the industrial processes associated with that, how they're transported from manufacturer to the construction site, the construction process itself, any reuse of materials on a building site. So if we're changing the roof in 60 years or changing the windows, there's a carbon impact with those materials that we're bringing to the building. And even the end of life, how we demolish and repurpose and recycle the materials. So basically on this slide, everything in the blue shaded areas would be the emissions associated with those activities is what we mean when we say embodied carbon. And you can see that's quite a lot of activities, right? There's a lot more to the carbon footprint of our buildings than just the energy that we use on an annual basis, which is the traditional way that we've been managing carbon in our built environment. And on this slide, I like to show how why this embodied carbon is becoming such a pressing issue and is really gaining a lot of attention recently, and it's going to become even more important in the future. And the simple reason is because our operational energy and operational carbon footprint of our buildings are reducing over time. Every new building that gets built is more energy efficient and uses less carbon than buildings of the past. As we all know, we have new building codes that are continuously being updated, and we're decarbonizing our energy system. So when you put those two aspects together, buildings of today and of the future are using significantly less carbon in their operations, ideally getting to net zero in their operations. But we haven't been doing a good job traditionally of reducing the embodied carbon associated with making, transporting, and using those materials. So now it's the bottom part of the slide is more of what our actual new high efficiency buildings carbon footprints are looking like, that the embodied carbon is now a very significant portion of the carbon footprint of our buildings, whereas in the past, it was a rounding error. It was all dominated by operational, but that's not the case anymore. And the really interesting thing is if you look at the 10-year, that little blue box on the left in the left corner, when we look at shorter timelines, not the traditional 60 years that we would measure a total life cycle of a building, but what about the next 10 years to 2030 or to 2035 or to 2040, these critical decades for our carbon targets? When we look at high efficiency buildings in that new environment of low carbon grids and shorter timelines, it's actually embodied carbon that's the dominant driving climate impact from new high efficiency construction. So this is why it's become increasingly important. And as we decarbonize operations, it will just become more important to really tackle our embodied carbon emissions. This slide just shows the same thing in a different way, different visuals, showing that currently embodied carbon, the red is a minor part of our total building carbon footprint. But over time, as we're getting that gray operations down to zero, we're going to be left with only the embodied. So we really need to start thinking about how to manage that. And when we're talking about reuse and rehabilitation, one strategy to minimize that embodied carbon is to get more of our materials from reuse and rehabilitation, from salvaged. We want to talk about things like deconstructing our buildings and having salvage yards of high quality usable materials that we can use in future renovations. And CSA Group has a number of standards to support this, including a standard on designing for disassembly so that buildings are put together in a way that they can easily be disassembled. And they have another standard on designing for deconstruction, on how to do that in an appropriate way. So obviously those salvage materials have a significantly lower carbon footprint to salvage them and reuse them than to make virgin materials in many cases. So in this report, we wanted to dive into some of these strategies and put some numbers to the ideas, right? And to understand what the carbon savings actually is with some of this reuse. And again, as Helen said, these were very significant reports that we really can't do justice in the 10 minutes we have. So if people want to dig into this, I really would recommend you to check out the report in detail. But what we did in a nutshell was looked at various different building types or office types, a high-rise and a mid-rise office. And we looked at it in 3 different regions across the country, in Toronto, Vancouver, or Edmonton. And then we said, what would the carbon footprint be of a total of a deconstructing an existing building and a new construction? So our base case was that there was a building on a site. So case 1 was deconstruction and new construction. Case 2 was retrofitting that structure, was a deep carbon retrofit where we're replacing the envelope, we're replacing the mechanical and electrical systems. Basically, everything other than the structure is being replaced. And that's really what's needed when we're talking about a deep net zero operational retrofit. So this slide goes into a little bit more details about what decisions we made for some of these elements. And we did also look at the refrigerants, the refrigerant emissions. And the operational carbon footprint was basically based on the highest tiers of the local municipal standards. So we were saying, the best in class greenest building that we're seeing in these markets is how we modeled these. And we reuse the structure in the case of the reuse. That was the main carbon difference between the 2 scenarios in each of the regions. This slide just shows some of the life cycle assessment, the life cycle phases that were looked at. And one thing to just point out here is that normally, if anyone's familiar with life cycle assessment, normally this image, you recognize this, but normally it starts at A, right, which is the production of the raw materials. But because we were realizing that, you know, the demolition of an existing building is something that we shouldn't be ignoring. So we've actually put the C phase, that demolition, deconstruction, and waste transportation, we've doubled that basically. So we're showing it up front, which represents the demolition of the existing building, and then also in its traditional spot after the use phase, which is the demolition of the new building. So this was how we did the analysis on this project, which was a little bit unique, and we're hoping that we're going to see more projects include that demolition of existing buildings when they're looking at their carbon footprint, because most projects are ignoring that, and we think that's probably not the most appropriate approach. So just to quickly show the results here of some of the key takeaways, this is the Toronto mid-rise scenario, and you can see that the new construction on the left has a much larger section associated with the embodied emissions, that gray box, and the embodied emission increases over time at some key times in the future, because of that's when we see things like windows being replaced or a roof replacement, or, you know, a major kind of renovation on the project. But the vast majority of the embodied emissions happens up front at the construction process. And you can see in the retrofit scenario on the right-hand side, that gray embodied emissions box is significantly lower. Probably it looks like it's about a third lower in this scenario. And you can see that at 2030, the total life cycle carbon savings of the retrofit scenario is about 57% lower than the demolition and new building scenario. And at 2050, it's about 41%. So that percentage savings due to renovation reduces over time, just because the operational emissions are taking up more of the total carbon footprint of the building. So that's why those numbers are just reducing over time. And it's different in the different markets, because this is the high-rise example. Now we're seeing a similar trend, but just the numbers themselves are a little bit different. But the trends are staying the same, right? The retrofit has a significantly reduced upfront carbon emission, and we're seeing significant savings due to the retrofit scenario, even out to 2050, right? It's over a 20% savings, even when we look out to 2050. So those were just, you know, two of the snapshots. As I said, there's many more in the report, but the general, you know, high level takeaway here is that in all cases, the retrofit scenario is the lower carbon scenario. You know, there was no scenario that we ran where a demolition and a new build was a better carbon decision. And the scale of that, as I said, just depends on the size of the building and the location and the operational mix, right? How much carbon is in the operational footprint of the electricity grid, how much energy is used to operate that building. Those are the factors that change how much carbon is saved for the retrofit. But in all cases, it was definitely the low carbon option. And that was really a key takeaway here. Some other recommendations is, you know, sometimes new construction is required. We're not, you know, saying that it's realistic that we're never going to do a demolition and a new construction. We want to just save those for special cases where it's really the only option, or where there's many other social benefits for that. But we don't want it to be the default, which it currently kind of seems to be that it's the default. So when there are situations where it does make sense to do the demolition and renovation, we really want to make sure we're doing everything we can to use low carbon materials. Salvaged materials, as I said, is a great place to start, but if not, at least a low carbon concrete, low carbon steel, or a bio-based material. So something that actually takes carbon out of the atmosphere as it grows. So think for wood, for example. There's also new innovative materials being developed that are made out of agricultural byproducts, things like, you know, corn husks or coconut shells. You know, these are not things that might not be at scale yet, but these are the solutions of the future that we need to be starting to support, because all of those solutions are really helping us take carbon out of the atmosphere and locking them into our built environment. And another interesting finding here, we found that if you account for that biogenic carbon that is stored within a material, then the new construction with biogenic carbon actually has a very similar carbon footprint to a retrofit scenario. So there are ways and solutions to minimize that footprint of the new construction. We also, you know, a lot of the outcome here was lessons learned in terms of data gaps and what we need to have more information about to do, to have this be a more broadly acceptable quantification approach by industry. We really need more data associated with demolition. That's a big blind spot of the industry. As I said, we're kind of using life cycle assessment associated with demolition of current construction, but there's not much data about, the fuel and the consumption required to demolish existing buildings. We also want to have we need better life cycle data around interiors, mechanical system, electrical systems, and plumbing. All of these elements that are traditionally overlooked, even in the whole building life cycle assessment space. Typically, a whole building life cycle assessments are mostly looking at the shell, the structure of a building, the core of a building, and the shell of the building, so the envelope of the building. But those are not the only carbon footprint in construction. So we really need to, as an industry, really start to understand the total carbon footprint of all of these systems and looking for ways to minimize them across the board. So that was a lightning take through the report, but hopefully that spurred some interesting thoughts from some folks here. And yeah, happy to take a question and maybe be part of a discussion later on. And yeah, feel free to reach out anytime if you want to discuss any of that in more detail.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ryan, for giving that overview. And like you said, it's really good to be quantifying some of what we think are, the assumptions going into this by doing some of this LCA work. There are a number of questions that have come into the Q&A box, and maybe we'll ask the top one here, and then I'll let you respond to a few of the others in the Q&A box, if you don't mind, so we're not running too far behind on our schedule. But one of the questions was just curious to get your thoughts on the scaling up of the deconstruction sector and driving sort of the use and reuse of materials from demolition or deconstruction at the end of the life. Do you see that as having a net positive savings from a carbon footprint standpoint? What are some considerations there in terms of those materials?
It's a great question. And I think I briefly mentioned it, but maybe just to answer that question by pointing back to that CSA standard, those two standards, they're really a pair of standards. One is on designing for disassembly, because if a building is not designed, to be disassembled, then it's very difficult to do that. You're gonna have a lot of waste associated with it. But if you are, thoughtful in your design process to not use adhesives, for example, right? We're talking about using mechanical fasteners, so screws or bolts, things that can be undone simply, and you can take the structure apart and reuse them and repurpose them. Those basically means you can reuse that material for basically a zero carbon footprint, because it would otherwise be going to the demolition, to the landfill, and the carbon has already, was already emitted during that first project. It's being used by that first construction project. But if we can disassemble, deconstruct, and set up salvage, a scenario where new projects can understand what materials are available to them and can start designing using those materials, then it really will help extend the life of these materials. So it's not just a one building lifespan that it's being used for, but it can be really part of the circular economy and be reused multiple times. We're doing some work with the City of Toronto on looking on how to implement this a little bit further. And we've done research into places like in Vancouver. They have a deconstruction bylaw in place already for homes that were built before 1910. Similarly, in Palo Alto, there's a deconstruction and a salvage bylaw. There's a demolition. There's a ban on demolition. I think it's in Palo Alto, where you need to deconstruct the building. So there are examples that we can point to. There are policies in place, and really the time is now for leadership from policymakers across the country to take those best practices and implement them in their local jurisdictions.
Super. Great, thanks, Ryan, and appreciate your time sharing the results here. As you mentioned, there's a lot more detailed information in the technical report that people can dig into, and they can reach out if they have other questions. But maybe if you don't mind having a look at those Q&A questions as well, and we can answer some of those as we move along in the agenda. Much appreciated. Excellent. I'd like to, for the next 45 minutes or so, for the remainder of our session, invite an industry panel to join us who will help us reflect on some of those two presentations anyway, and what they've just heard from Helen and Ryan, and share their perspectives from across the construction real estate value chain. So we're delighted to have three insights here today with Hazel Sutton, who's the Director of Sustainability for the Property and Asset Management Group, JLL. And they're a global real estate services firm specializing in commercial property and investment management. We also have Enlai Hui, who is an architect, industrial designer, and the head of innovation with Schmidt Hammer Lassen Architects out of Denmark. And he specializes in the integration of engineering fields within sort of circular design and architecture. We'll share a little bit about what he's seeing internationally, I think. And Jolene McLaughlin, who's the Vice President of Climate and Sustainability for Ellis Dawn Corporation, who, as many probably know here, is a leading construction services company that are delivering projects in every market and sector around the world. So I thought I'd just kick things off maybe by inviting our three panel participants to reflect, in 2 or 3 minutes, just what resonated with you in those presentations, what was top of mind, and then we can open up a bit of a discussion. So maybe we'll stop sharing screens and we can bring up our panel here. If you want to unmute yourselves. And Hazel, why don't we invite you to go first here?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. And hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And thanks again to CSA and to Circular Economy Leadership Council Canada, for getting us to where we are today and the fantastic work that was done in both of those reports. When I'm listening through to these presentations and reading the reports and the amazing summary that you're releasing today, it's really about how we can evolve our practices in our day-to-day and in the work that we do at JLL. We're looking at how we can decarbonize the portfolio of properties that we manage on behalf of third parties. And a big piece of that is focusing on that operational carbon, looking at strategies around efficiency, electrification, and renewable energy. And this is a really good reminder to look upstream to tackle those emissions associated with the raw resource extraction, the manufacturing, the transportation, and the disposal. And then when you add to that the fact that we also there's going to definitely be physical transformations that have to happen at the building level to be more resilient to the impacts of climate change, as well as renewal of the asset, extending life cycle of the asset, and tenant fit outs, for example, then we can use all of these strategies, looking at the operational carbon, looking at these embodied carbon elements, to really help us accelerate and deepen our impact on mitigating those emissions. And to your point, to the point that Helen made earlier, not only is that going to help us achieve our decarbonization objectives more quickly, it also has all of the associated benefits of the environmental and social benefits associated with not having to extract raw resources, not having to open more landfill for our waste. So I think what's really exciting is that we're all stakeholders in a bit of a different place in the value chain. And now, you're bringing us together to be able to have these conversations and see how we can all have our impact in our lanes, and also be communicating with each other and sharing what we're doing.
Fantastic. Maybe I can just ask you a question here, Hazel. I'd love to know, how much are some of these strategies that Helen was talking about on the minds of, the real estate asset owners or managers in Canada today?
I mean, so, when you look down to the core of it, we've been doing circular strategies. Circular strategies have been part of the work that we do at properties for decades now, when you're focusing on building efficiency and extending the life of the equipment that's in the properties. So through preventative maintenance programs, these are well understood. A lot of focus has also been on end of life in terms of reducing waste, increasing how much diversion of our waste we're able to do. So lots of innovative practices there. I've got a great example at the Oshawa Center, which is a Ivanhoe Cambridge property, where there are using the unused chopsticks have been transformed into really cool art and also functional materials like a table that people are able to sit at in the food court. So that's looking at the end of life. We're also now looking at procurement. So tools like BOMA Best and the new version 4 coming out is also asking to the extent to which there's circular economy principle built in and woven in within procurement. So I think that's certainly going to make a lot more, that's going to be a lot more visible moving forward for wherever it's not already in place. What is still rare, I think, is the innovative leasing side of things. So looking at products as a service. There aren't as many opportunities in Canada as we've seen in other regions, but certainly that's growing. And I think part of our responsibility here is figuring out what those good solutions will look like and how we can apply them across our assets. embodied carbon, to Ryan's point, is still not the primary focus. So we're still very much looking at operational carbon within property management, and within the work that we're doing with our owners and investors, where we're looking at how can we decarbonize those properties from their operational carbon. But of course, to Helen's point, and with that fantastic map of where legislation is going, we know it's a matter of time. And so this is absolutely the right time to start looking at the impacts of embodied carbon and using that in the math in a de facto way across the roadmaps that we're helping to build. And we know that we can do it. It is being done. You've got amazing examples in both of these reports. JLL also has 2 office fit outs that were completed out of the UK for JLL offices that embedded, that were fully circular design and construction. And so, really deeply looking into the material selection, making sure it was low carbon, making sure that that the finishes, to Ryan's point earlier, could be disassembled, choosing refurbished furniture, understanding from the get-go, what are we going to do with this material at the end of its life, and how can we actually just basically collect it all and move it to the new office that we might need if we continue to grow. So the conversations are definitely shifting. Everything that's been covered today is going to continue to play a much larger part, I think, for sure, in the conversations that we're having internally, but also with the owners and the investors of these properties.
That's great. Yeah, so it's on people's radar. Need to continue to make the business case and figure out the drivers in different ways. That's super. Jolene, maybe I'll invite you next just to reflect on the 2 presentations.
Yeah, I think they've echoed what we've been seeing elsewhere, that there's lots of evidence we need to move faster on retrofitting our existing buildings to hit our climate targets. And Hazel mentioned a lot about that as well. And so we need to see how we can focus that effort and really push that envelope. What we see from the developer side is they need some more financial mechanisms that will allow us to kind of move forward. And so I think thinking about how we look beyond the expected energy savings as the way to pay off these retrofits, because that's never really going to play out. And so can we start to evaluate carbon as a performance metric, at least pulling in a carbon shadow price? We've had projects largely with the federal government where their whole requirements around adding that $170 per ton to the operational side of the carbon of the emissions shows how much you have to push for that net zero kind of option, and it starts to bring it into play. And so can we then do that also on the materials side, which we are trying to do that on our new builds, specifically around concrete, just trying to compare how the schedule and the cost and the carbon all fit into the performance requirements. I think part of this also, Hazel mentioned, bringing everybody out of their silos and working together, that really is key. And the construction industry has been really traditionally set up to kind of everybody work in their own silos, everybody work on their own thing, everybody try to find the best way to manage the risk, which absolutely makes sense. But can we work on managing that risk together so we can manage it more effectively? It doesn't get dumped onto one side of the equation. And we can also start to bring in some of these other really beneficial performance requirements into the structures too.
I think you touched on a really important point there at the end about not treating the value chain in sort of silos or isolation. I mean, especially since, so many decisions get made by maybe the building owners or developers in collaboration with their architecture teams, for example. Can you speak maybe just briefly, Jolene, in terms of how a leader or a company like Elliston is working with those upstream players to help maybe influence some of these decisions or come up with collective project pathways, I guess, that maybe are able to build circular strategies into practice?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 pieces to that. The first one being making sure that the goals are clearly defined and communicated all the way through the chain. And so, you touched on making sure that the value chain all the way across actually has enough leverage to move things forward. But I think it's about education as well. If we are going after a lower carbon concrete item, or the architects are specifying something that has a take-back program, manufacturer with a take-back program, if the subtrades don't understand that there's a carbon metric, or that take back program is part of the initiative, we actually won't hit the targets that we want to in the end, and we can't follow that all the way through. So there's that big communication piece that we need to look at differently, I would say. The specs aren't the only way to communicate. How can we make sure that those things are really clear? And then internally, we're also developing, we've been a builder for more than 70 years. We've built some of the most critical infrastructure across the country, but we also have teams that are really deep in how to manage buildings and how to project manage the process of buildings. And so even if you're not working with us on a build specifically, we can help you, evaluate the opportunities, look at embodied carbon, look at the feasibility of a retrofit. And so how do you bring those components into your project team, no matter where you're sitting, really?
That's great. Well, maybe I'll use this as an opportunity to ask Enlai to weigh in with his initial thoughts, given he comes from the architecture world, works a lot with developers and building owners. And Enlai, you're joining us a few hours ahead, coming from Europe tonight. So thanks for participating, and I welcome your initial thoughts.
Thank you, Paul, and I hope you can hear me properly.
Yeah.
I'm just, this is developing into a really interesting conversation, and I just want to flag that, I'm based typically in Copenhagen in Denmark, but we work all around the world, and in fact, we're part of a group called Perkins and Will, who I think are also based in Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, and British Columbia, Vancouver. To my mind, carbon is very powerful, and policies and leverage from guides of how things might be done on a voluntary class, or how things might be instituted into law, are extremely important. So tomorrow, actually, I'll be in Zurich for a European initiative based on the right to demolish, meaning that at the moment you have the right to cut. You can't cut down a tree without, in the sort of public sphere, without making an application for it, but you're allowed to demolish as you like. And so policy is probably the most powerful mechanism, and of course carbon, especially with our targets now to 2030 and 2050, have folded into that. But as an architecture firm that works globally, we also have to bait ourselves with the question and play the devil's advocate. How would you convince somebody that just doesn't care? We're talking in a forum of, obviously it's wonderful to see that there's 135 participants in the forum. But when we go out into industry and we go to different countries that are outside Denmark, which has an extremely strong position with regards to carbon, and it's the only country that actually has literally a number per square meter per year benchmark of total carbon embodied as well as operational for their buildings. When we move beyond those borders, we have a vastly different levers and opportunities. And so what we're working on as a company is to work out what is going to convince people that have no levers or don't have the intention, desire, or understanding about these the potential benefits of circularity or adaptive transformation or adaptive reuse. How do we convince them to actually, on a business case level or on a desire level or a design level, how do we convince them to actually preserve existing buildings? And we can see that there's a kind of train crash ahead of us in the US and in Canada because of all of these buildings that are emptying in the city centers. We've seen Calgary as a case, but now Seattle, San Francisco, and places on the East Coast. And so, the city centers, the CBDs, will only hold out for a certain time before buildings start coming down if we don't present a hardcore business case about how these things can be transformed profitably. And so that's the focus of our company right now. I do have slides about it, but maybe we can flick back to them now or later. It's up to you, Paul.
Sure. If it helps to build the story in terms of the work you're doing and how you're helping to build the business case, I think that would be great if you want to share.
Yeah. Okay, I'll share a few very quick slides and let me know when you can see my screen. First of all, great. First of all, we have to frame things within the realm of circularity, because of course, especially with embodied carbon, the most logical and the first thing that you want to do is don't do anything at all. You want to not build anything, or reorganize your own interior spaces before you do anything like harvest, adapt, reuse materials or components, etc. But the overlooked middle child of this scenario is the transformation part. It's where a building ceases to become useful for the typology for which it's built. And in this case, offices are a danger right now in the US and Canada. What could they become if they were not offices? Before you start to think about harvesting materials, which is a massive downgrading of the value of the building in the first place. So we've just already seen a report about this. This is also from Ramboll backing it up, that even when you calculate embodied and operational carbon, over the lifespan of a building, it's at least twice as good to do a deep retrofit and change the typology or the program of a building. And the reason why transformations of things like office buildings are typically when you have a similar square meter, output for another program, the reason why they're often demolished is not because they would be cheaper or more expensive to transform. Usually it can be cheaper because most of the product is right there before you demolish in the first place. But the simple point that the margin of error, how you calculate the transformation, how you calculate labor, and how you calculate the costs of taking things out and putting things back in, are grossly understudied in transformation versus new build. And so this margin of error can cause the destruction of buildings. Also, of course, a lack of imagination on behalf of the client, or the lack of ability to calculate risk on behalf of the underwriters, the insurers or the financiers. But if we look at the interesting thing from my perspective, is that the cost of transformation is primarily in labor, and with new build, it's primarily in material, where you're essentially shifting the labor to other countries where it's cheaper in order to squeeze down the margin that's left over after the material cost. And of course, we talk about carbon, but we don't really talk about the massive material waste, which itself is an environmental disaster. When we talk about transformation, most of the labor is localized. And if we can do something to accurately calculate the labor, then that could be an enormous win for local economies as well. So the idea is to really take the margin of error and analyze the process of transformation to the point where it becomes carte blanche a better business case than demolition. And that's what I think we should all be aiming for. So there are different levers, if you like. If you ignore political levers, there are other levers that matter in the social milieu and also in development. These are some of them. And two projects that we're working on right now. One is about the really creating a construction simulation to calculate the cost of transformation if you were to use offsite manufacturing and timber, for example. And the other one is to look at the idea of the stranded assets and use AI to help us do geometric calculations to say, if a building didn't have an identity, if it wasn't an office building and it just existed as a structure, what could it possibly be? And we're using different types of digital processes to be able to calculate that, and using natural language processing with AI to be able to infer codes for different typologies into existing structures. So that's me. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you.
I don't want to go over time.
I think that's a really interesting point to really dig into that margin of error so that you can better understand, what are the risks, what are the real costs, what are the labor considerations, what are the supply chain considerations. And maybe I'll just ask, are you seeing a growing interest in some markets where you're working? Like, how much is this happening in Canada, these conversations today versus Europe or other places?
Absolutely. There was a sea change that happened between last year and this year. And part of it is due to the fact that there's so much stress in the market at the moment, both on the municipal side with regards to decreasing rents and emptying cities. on the developers or the asset owner's side with regards to stranded assets, because if they can't change the typology or use of their building easily enough, they essentially have something that's costing them money. And then finally, also with the notion that with regards to carbon, with regards to environment, the political sphere is starting to wake up to the fact that the embodied carbon involved in demolition, the waste and the destruction, if you like, of the social milieu that happens. We talk about embodied carbon, but what about embodied culture as well? These are things that really have been in the habit of creating gentrification in cities in a very unhealthy way and not letting communities stay in place and survive. So many things are, there's a confluence of these factors, and that's really also triggered by the fact that material prices are going haywire and business as usual is no longer business as usual. So the margin of error, that the risk that could be calculated in demolition and new build, that's being totally upended by the logistics and the material prices that we've experienced over the last couple of years. So by default, there's, if you like, a necessity to reinvest or look into transformation.
Super interesting. Hazel, maybe I'll come back to you just to ask a question, or feeding off of Enlai's comments around that margin of error and digging into some of the risk, and the question more along the lines of what do we need to do to improve the awareness and the business case for encouraging these types of strategies and practice within within JLL or your other organizations in kind of property management and asset ownership space.
I mean, so Enlai, that was fascinating. Thank you for sharing those slides. They really help drive the point home of that it's identifying that risk and then solving for the risk, and having a straight up understanding of exactly what it's going to take, and basically trying to get rid of that risk, so that your business case becomes much more self-evident and you don't need to convince anybody. It's just it's a business as usual type of calculation. And I think more of these discussions, more of the case studies that are in the report, basically demonstrating over and over again that there is a return on investment, and that this leads to assets that are beautiful and desirable, and that you are, this is a very this is an evolution of the way that you can see your property. And I think so the role that we'd like to play within JLL, within this property management space, and what's really exciting about where we are, is that we are in a position to be able to influence some of those conversations. We have a lot of intervention points, and for us, what those are, because we are looking, we're the boots on the ground property management teams in the building, having discussions with the owners and the asset managers. And our opportunities for those interventions become at the points of renovation, fit outs, that building life extension, and whenever there's maybe some asset repositioning, so that we can start to make those business cases, help the building owners and managers, asset managers understand what it would mean to implement those circular procurement those design and construction strategies into their future plans. It's only going to help accelerate their objectives of decarbonization. The business case, like it exists. I think what we need to do now is just keep repeating it. And so what we can do in our role, where I sit and my team and all of the team across basically in property management, I think the mantle that we can pick up here is testing out those solutions. And so figuring out who can we work with, who can we work with to support those reverse logistics that are needed, that make things a little bit more complicated at the end of life if you're deconstructing. From the report, we understand that waste haulers could play a really big role in that, but they're not ready yet. So we can start having those conversations with other property management organizations. If we all start asking more or less the same thing, we can start accelerating the learning curve that has to happen within those service companies to adapt the way that they're doing business, so that they can meet the needs, our growing needs, and we can discover that together. Figuring out what those innovative leasing companies are, what are the best solutions for for products as a service, for electronics, for carpeting, et cetera. So having sort of our list of who we know what we know works, the companies that we know can help us deliver on that. And that's, us coming together, learning about who's able to do what, and then continuing to refine those relationships. So to your point in life, so there's no more risk. We already know what that solution looks like. And the work, some of the journey that we'll be taking at JLL is working with our construction services team, with our procurement team, to start embedding those construction design and principles, design and construction principles into the work that we're doing, trying to see to what extent we can make it business as usual, so that we are in a, we're building that buy-in within our organization across our clients to really understand that this is absolutely the future. Embodied carbon is not going away. This is how we need to continue to do business, and how we're going to be able to make our assets more resilient and future-proof them, with changing legislation, and just ensuring that they remain beautiful and desirable, and servicing the community that they're in, and that they're not just adding more negative environmental impacts. So yeah, it's an exciting time, and there's still work to be done. And so that's why it's great that we're all here to talk about it, so we can learn from each other.
I think those are great suggestions. Yeah, go ahead, Emily.
Sorry, I think this is like precisely the point of trying to create business as usual out of something that's more logical, which is transformation than it is demolition, right? The one thing that we're working on at Perkins Moyle and SHL that might unlock this scenario is the simple fact that there is no simulation software that deals with construction process for existing structures. So that thing that should exist, which is essentially BIM software or a design software that allows you to work with existing structures, move stuff in and out of it, work out what the biggest piece is that you can put in and the time that it would take to get there, that just doesn't exist in the AEC industry. Once you unlock that, then you can, squeeze the margin of error of cost and time overruns, and you can start producing off-site manufactured components like you would for a new build. All of these things, that's one side of it. And then, of course, there's the design side of it. And on the designer side, architects are not typically trained to imagine their way through an existing structure as well. And so we're trying to tackle both of those things simultaneously. So we do need relationships with people like you at JLL, so that when you have you spot a stranded asset risk, then you can already start talking to us about what the procedure and the cost would be for transformation from one typology to another. So, I obviously see a business opportunity here, but I think this should be standard in the industry, and it's definitely not.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe I'll start to bring in a few of the questions that have come in from the Q&A box here as well. And Jolene, thanks for jumping in on a couple of them as they've evolved. There is one that you responded to that I'd love to bring to the group, which was, this idea of empty office space being converted into residential. And certainly it was touched on by Helen as an opportunity area. I'm just wondering if any of the three of you have examples of where that's been successful, or what are some of the key issues or criteria for us to be thinking about as you're thinking about that, specifically that office to residential conversion. Jolene, do you want to start, just given your initial thoughts in the Q&A box? Oh, and you're on mute.
There we go. So through our Calgary team, as Helen said, that seems to be the market that's pushing forward, especially with all of the office space that changed over. And so we worked with a number of clients just to evaluate the overall floor plate, to evaluate the existing HVAC, and provide some more analysis on the constructability and logistics side of things. And I know there's a number of tools in the market that kind of support that evaluation from an architectural design perspective. But a couple of the things that we found important were efficient site layout, and I think a lot of that was highlighted in the report. Vertical transportation, which was also talked about in the report, in terms of making sure that the exiting loading is sufficient for changing occupancy types. Sound transmission and windows can be a bit of an evaluation perspective as well. And then the HVAC, if it's something that you're significantly going to have to change in order to supply the right types and volumes of air to the right suites, that added cost can kind of take it away. Calgary, and I think this was mentioned in the report as well, had a really good incentive program through the city. And so I think that really helped us, get our feet wet and learn the opportunity there. So it's valuable.
Super. Any further thoughts, Enlai or Hazel, on that office to residential conversion?
Yeah, I mean, that was the sort of a priori starting point of some of our research, and we've done office to resi before. What we often find is that there are certain, and actually there's a really good article from the New York Times that's called How to Solve a 25-Story Rubik's Cube. So you can look that one up, which discusses exactly this point. But I think that there's, in a way, a kind of design level laziness in the market to convert the things that have an immediacy from office directly to residential. And what you find is that you've got your B and C grade buildings in Calgary or in San Francisco, etc., being converted into a relatively unfit residential because there are certain buildings that have the depth of floor plate, the vertical transportation, the exits that would simply comply with code. And therefore they'll do the minimum translations that are necessary. But there's a class of buildings where the floor plates are just too deep to do that properly. There's a class of buildings that have, again, to mention vertical transportation, HVAC exits, floor to window ratios, etc., that make it very difficult to transform into a standard residential. And this is the asset class that's likely to be demolished. The ones that can be easily translated into residential, that's happening, one by one like dominoes. And there's a certain asset class that, due to the structural or the physical embodiment of what you have, or due to the market, which is not specifically, where residential is not specifically valuable in that space, these are the things that are at risk of demolition. And so in the last slide, there was this thing, what does the building want to be? And the research that we're doing right now is basically taking any particular structure, geometrically analyzing that structure against any local code that you can throw at it using, AI, to be able to figure out what are going to be the sticking points or the difficulties if you were to transform one typology or one programmatic designation into another. And that can include mixed programs, etc. So what we're trying to do is create a level of intelligence where even if we ourselves as architects can't see the potential of transformation, we can ask, how does it suit according to these requirements or those qualities? And this doesn't limit itself to code. You can describe any number of qualities and get the geometrics software to actually check these relationships for you so that you can scan whole hundreds of buildings or potential stranded assets in large portfolios and figure out what could match the market that the building could transform into.
I'm sorry that we have to wrap things up. It's been a really interesting conversation and some really good insights that have been shared here by all three of you. And I'd like to invite Ryan and Helen back to just say thanks for your input and your information and your insights, and also for the great research that went into these reports. A few additional questions came in, which we'll send to the group and maybe share back with a summary here for the ones we didn't get to. But just want to say a big thanks again to the presenters, and also opportunity to stay informed as this work evolves and our work with the CSA Group continues to evolve. We have a monthly newsletter. We have a partner network, which you're welcome to participate and join us in doing this work together. And just to say, if Vicha is still on the line, that November 1st and 2nd, we're going to be co-hosting a session at the Zero Waste Conference in Vancouver focused on embodied carbon and the addressing sort of the life cycle emissions and embodied carbon in buildings through circular economy strategies. So again, a big thanks to everybody here. Vicha, over to you for the last words.
Yeah, again, just to repeat, thank you everyone, all the panelists, and of course Helen and Ryan for an amazing work, which, as we can hear, really will serve all the stakeholders involved in this important topic. We're happy that we are evolving our work again with Helen and also the team at the Ivy Business School to develop a possible strategic framework for the built environment for Canada, and looking at things such as standards, but also markets and regulation. So this is again under the initiative led by Paul and CELC. So very grateful for being able to continue this work. Thank you once again, everyone, and you have our contact details here, so do not hesitate to reach out for any question or comment. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.